Alright, this video is meant to guide my students through their section that they're working through in Biology 30. So we are looking at Chapter 20. Just a comment that these notes are taken from the Inquiry into Biology textbook. So I make no claim that they are my own. They're simply meant to aid them as they work through that section of the textbook. Alright, let's get going. Okay, so this video is on section 20.2, which is about interactions in ecological communities. Okay, so by ecological community, we mean an association of interacting populations that inhabit a defined area. Within a community, individuals may compete for limited resources, and that competition, those interactions between individuals, both individuals of the same population or from different populations, they are a driving force between population dynamics, or how those populations change over time. So just an example of where this might be used in the real world would be this map. Here, this map shows studies that biologists have done tracking the population changes of different jellyfish species around the world. So species that have been native to that area or invading species, and how they interact and how that is changing the populations around. So lots of practical applications that biologists use this stuff for. Alright, so firstly we will look at intra-specific competition. So remember, intra, that means within something. So in this case, within a species, specific species. So competition within a species. This is a density-dependent population factor, which we referred to in the last video. And this density-dependent factor is going to limit the growth of a population. It plays also an important role in natural selection. So the idea is there that some individuals within a species are going to be better suited to survive. Maybe they've got an ability to gather food or hunt better than maybe some of the other organisms within their population, and so they're going to have a better chance to survive long enough to reproduce, and that would mean that it is more likely that those genes are going to be the ones that are going to be passed on to the next generation, and over several generations you might see some changes within that species. So this intra-specific competition really drives that natural selection. It's interesting to think that some species they have this intraspecific competition between parents and offspring. So there are some species, many examples actually that you could think of, that attempt to avoid this competition. So for example, in plants, you see many plants dispersing their seeds around. So instead of just dropping the seeds right beneath the tree, for example, those seeds would be taken in the wind to land somewhere else, and that way they don't need to compete against their offspring, right? Other plants would depend on animals to eat their fruit, and then the animals would move around and do their business, and those seeds then would be transferred to other locations. Other examples would be insects that would undergo complete metamorphosis. So for example, your caterpillar into butterfly, and by doing that, by having two completely different sets of needs between parent and offspring, you now have eliminated or certainly reduced the competition. So that's the idea. And these pictures show a couple examples of some intra-specific competition. A lot of it comes down to mating as well. So you've got peacocks here. The male peacocks, they're going to show off their plumage to try to attract their mate. Likewise, we've got deer that are going to battle it out, and often you'd have the deer with the biggest set of antlers is going to succeed and then have the opportunity to mate and pass on those traits to their offspring. So that's the idea behind intra-specific competition. Okay, so there's also obviously a competition between species. So inter-specific competition. Inter means between, so between species competition. We see this lots of different places, everywhere really, that there's competition for limited resources. So these resources might be nutrients, light, living space. Any of those we refer to as interspecific competition. So you can see in this example of a forest, all of these plants, organisms would be competing for the same nutrients, for light, and so you can see that some plants are going to be more healthy than others because they're going to have a better opportunity to gain those nutrients or to gain that light that they would need, that sort of thing. One of the effects of interspecific competition is that no two species are going to share the exact same ecological niche. It's impossible really to find them share exactly the same two, because that competition would likely drive one of those organisms out, or perhaps eliminate that organism. So even if there's just slightly different niches, that competition is going to be much less fierce, and it's possible that several different organisms that have similar niches but not the same will be able to survive and even thrive. One thing that we observe is often when non-native species are introduced, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, they will compete with native species, and often that results in a significant change to the structure of the ecological community, and that's because those niches between the non-native species and the native ones are often very similar, and if potentially that non-native species is stronger or better adapted to that environment, potentially it could cause the native species to lose that competition and maybe even be eliminated from that community. Okay, next thing we'll look at is the producer-consumer interactions. So a couple definitions you're probably familiar with. Predators. Predators are organisms that kill and consume other organisms, and the things that they kill or consume we refer to as prey. So the producer-consumer relationship is, I guess, related to that somehow, and we'll look more specifically at predator-prey on the next slide. But producer-consumer is a similar idea. One is consuming the other. And that puts selective pressure on both partners. So producers that are more difficult to obtain or less desirable to consume, so perhaps there's a bitter taste or something like that, they're going to be more likely to survive because the consumers are going to not desire them as much, and instead they will go after things that are easy to get or that taste better. So that potentially can lead to changes in the numbers of these populations. In addition, the scarcity of a producer species could also limit the consumer species population. So if one consumer depends primarily on one producer, and all of a sudden, for whatever reason, that producer's population goes down, that's obviously going to have an effect on the consumer's population as well. Okay, so we mentioned predator-prey interactions. It's interesting to observe that this concept of predator-prey interactions often follow a predictable cycle. We call it the boom or bust cycle, and we can see that in this graph here. So what we see is often we start with large prey populations. So in this graph, the prey is the blue line, Right? And if we have a large prey population, that would mean that we would have more food and energy for predators. So you can see, maybe I should change my pen color here to a neutral color. There we go. We're going to see that the predator, represented by the red, is going to follow shortly after the prey goes up, so because it's got all that food and energy available. So that's going to increase the predator population, but if there's more predators, that means the prey is going to start dropping off, obviously, because they will be preyed upon by more predators. So that's going to lead to a decrease in prey population, which now causes more competition for the predators, and so we're going to see the predator population fall off. Now there's less predators, and so our prey is going to start to rise again, right? And you can see that the cycle is just going to continue. So this is observed in many different places, particularly in some northern species. We see this boom or bust cycle observed. Okay, this predator-prey interactions, just like the producer-consumer interactions, could potentially affect natural selection for some of these adaptive traits. Predator-prey interactions do the same thing. So predators that have traits that make them more successful at hunting, those would be the ones within a population that are going to be more successful, likely having a better chance to survive, to pass those traits on to their offspring. Now, prey that, predators that aren't very good at hunting, obviously they're going to have some issues and not be able to survive. On the opposite side, prey that have traits that are more successful at resisting predation are likely to survive. And those would be the ones then that would pass those traits on to their offspring. And again, over several offsprings, you might see some variation then. Some adaptability within a species. It's interesting to observe that producers and consumers typically co-evolve is the word that we use, and basically that means that if one organism is a producer and it changes because of some of these more desirable traits, it changes over time, it's likely that the consumers that would depend on that producer is also going to come up with some changes to be able to adapt to that as well, and we've seen this in several different organisms. Some examples of the traits that producers and prey would have developed or been created with include plants producing bitter tasting chemicals, protective thorns. You see sharp quills on some animals, cryptic coloration or camouflage. So you've got your classic examples of the chameleon or this toad. I don't know if you can see the toad hidden there. It is able to basically hide itself within its surroundings, so that's a pretty cool trait it's got. Then we've also got some things, mimicry, so mimicking something else. So we've got two types of mimicry. The first one is Batesian mimicry. This example here, you might think that looks like a wasp or a bee, and that's the point. It looks like that, but it's not. It's actually a type of a fly that is completely harmless, but it looks just like that, and because it appears like it's nasty bees or wasps that potentially can harm different organisms, that fly is often left alone, and that's its defense mechanism. So that's Batesian mimicry, when we've got one organism mimicking or trying to look like a well-defended model. We've got another type of mimicry, and that's down here with these two snakes. That's the Mullerian mimicry, and the idea behind that is both of them have undesirable traits. We've got the coral snake, and I'm not sure the name of the other type of snake, but the coral snake is very venomous. The other snake is venomous, but certainly not as much, but because they've got a similar banding pattern and that sort of thing, they're both undesirable for predators, and because they're close enough together, most predators are just going to leave them both alone just because they're not sure really which one they are, if they're the very venomous one or just the slightly venomous one. So these are all possible defense mechanisms that some species would employ in order to protect themselves against consumers or predators. Okay. This leads us to talking about symbiotic relationships, which is the direct or close relationship between individuals of different species. Usually, these relationships would involve some sort of organism that's going to live or feed in or on another organism. So we call the organism that is, hosting the other one, we call it the host. So there are three forms of symbiosis, and each of them are vary a little bit, so we'll explain them. The first one we'll look at is mutualism. The idea with mutualism, it is mutually beneficial to both of them. So both partners are going to benefit. So a classic example of that is within lichen. So lichen is a combination of an algae and a fungus. So you got a picture here, and it's growing on bare rock, which isn't where either of them would really be able to grow on their own, but together they are able to do this, and that is because they both benefit from each other. So the algae has the green chloroplasts in it, and so it's able to photosynthesize. That photosynthesis is going to produce food for both of the organisms. And the fungus produces an acid that's going to dissolve the rock, which that's going to release some of the minerals that are within the rock that are going to be needed by the algae. So algae provides food for the fungus, and the fungus provides the acid that's going to allow for the algae to be able to get the minerals that it needs to survive. So both benefit. That is an example of mutualism. Okay, our next example of symbiotic relationships would be commensalism. And this is the idea where one partner is going to benefit, the other one's not really affected, neither beneficial or harmful to them. So we got an example here of a shark. Often when you see a shark like this, you will often see little fish beside it called suckerfish. And the idea is they are going to hold their sucker-like dorsal fins. They're going to use those to hold fast to the shark's body, and that's going to allow them to receive protection because you're not going to have too many things coming to pick on the shark. And also, it's going to get access to the little bits of the food from the shark that the shark maybe misses or that sort of thing. So in reality, commensalism probably doesn't actually exist that much. It is likely that the shark in this example is affected somehow. It's just difficult to tell exactly how. Likely it would be more beneficial than harmful, or else you'd probably expect that the shark would make sure that those suckerfish get out of the way in a hurry. So in reality, probably commensalism is an ideal situation where but it's likely that the partner that is benefiting is probably having some effect on the host as well. But the ones that it's difficult to tell, we would refer to as commensalism. So then the third type of symbiosis we'll look at is parasitism, and that is when one partner, which we refer to as the parasite, is going to benefit at the expense of the host. So an example here is pictured. We've got mistletoe. So not just something you stand under and kiss at Christmas. Mistletoes are plants that live on trees and shrubs. They don't have their own developed leaves, so they can't make their own food. So what they do is they grow roots right into the bark and phloem of the conifer trees that they grow on. And so obviously this is going to have a negative effect on the tree. It's going to weaken the tree and predisposes it to disease. But the parasite here, the mistletoe, could care less because it's going to thrive. So because of this only benefiting parasites, parasites are among the most successful species in the world. Pretty much every type of species of wild and domesticated plants and animals have the potential to be affected by parasites. You could argue, however, though, if you think about it, that they play a very important role in limiting the growth of host populations. Potentially, they would help the host population as a whole, if you think big picture here, by reducing the density of the population and kind of weeding out the weaker hosts. So ones that would be more susceptible to parasitism are probably species within a population, would be organisms within a population that would likely be weaker, and that's going to limit the growth overall, but going to be weeding out kind of the weaker organisms. So if you think big picture, perhaps you could argue for the benefit of having parasites around. Okay, this will be one of the last sections we look at here, and this is the idea of succession, or the community changing over time. So basically it's the idea here of invasion and replacement of species in an ecosystem over time. So if you look at back in history, there's a lot of our ecosystems that look significantly different than they did maybe 50, 100 years ago, or more than that, and that is because of these processes of succession. So it's driven by both abiotic factors, so things like climate, and biotic factors, such as the interspecific competition that we've been talking about so far. So the first type of succession we'll talk about is primary succession. This is the idea of starting completely from scratch. So if we've got bare rocks left behind, maybe a glacier is retreating, or we've had a volcano and the molten rock has hardened over everything, and it's just bare rock now. We've got to start from scratch. This is the idea of primary succession, how it goes from that into a healthy ecosystem. So the first species to colonize an area to initiate the succession would be called the pioneer community. Generally speaking, these would be pretty small, opportunistic, meaning they're able to grow in pretty harsh conditions. So this species would grow maybe things like mosses, lichens, right? As they die, they're going to decompose and begin to form soil. Now that soil is going to have, it's going to increase the nutrient content over time, and we're going to have moisture then that's going to be able to be stored in the soil. The pH will change over time, and so soon we will have a situation where other organisms, other more complex, bigger organisms would be able to start growing in the area as well. We have to note that due to interspecific competition and the changing habitat, some populations are better able to survive and replace those that are unable to survive. So this succession plan could look different over time. Maybe there's an organism that is able to do well for a time, but over the longer period, maybe they're going to be replaced by something that's going to be able to survive better. The latecomers, as the minerals, the nutrients, that sort of thing start to grow and allow for different organisms, the ones that are coming later into the mix, we would call those climax communities. And you can see kind of the timeline of what that might look like in the diagram here on this slide. Okay, so that was primary succession. Secondary succession happens when we've got an ecological disturbance. So that's basically just something that's going to wipe out an entire ecosystem. So a good example would be forest fire or something like that. A natural disaster that's going to really change the ecosystem. So secondary succession then is recovering from an ecological disturbance. So generally, this is going to happen a lot faster, and that's because usually in these things the soil nutrients aren't lost. In fact, sometimes you would need a fire like this to actually cause the next offspring, the next generation to start growing. So, for example, your lodgepole pine needs the incredible heat from a forest fire in order to actually start growing. So this is a natural thing that these things occur every so often. And sometimes it needs to do that in order to be able to have the next generation grow. It also, secondary succession also includes changes in the composition and number of species over time. So in this diagram here, we start and we end with forests that look identical. In reality, it's probably going to look a little bit different the next generation, right? Because there'll be certain factors that might lead to it looking just a little bit different composition, different number of species next time around. Okay, and finally, looking at some of these natural disturbances. This is an important area of investigation within ecology. It's important to know how plants and animals are going to react to this, and how these ecological disturbances really provide new opportunities for species to grow. If biologists have a good understanding of that, then they're going to have a better ability to plan, to structure some of these communities that biologists would be involved with in repairing, and that would be a benefit in order to perhaps speed the process up and make sure that the ecosystem that would be developing would be a very healthy one. So that's all for section 20.2. Please let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.